Hi folks, and welcome to the second video in the 135th Border Models IV Panzer video series. In the last video we focused on the building and you can see the results here. In this video we're going to be focusing on the painting. The build was fairly straightforward. If you missed the last video, click the link in the description or in the card above. So after the assembly, I stripped the model back into its various sub-assemblies ready for painting. Most of this consisted of the turret, the stowage, the running gear and the add-on armour. So, let's get painting. First, we need to start with a good primer. I chose Badger Styrol Res Grey. This was given a good shake and then decanted into the airbrush. The Styrol Res was sprayed through my 0.2 Harder & Steenbeck Infinity airbrush. This was sprayed at around 25 psi and built up in 2 medium coats. Priming can be really useful because it gives your paint something to stick to. Also, it shows up any flaws that happened in the build process, allowing you to locate them and fix them before you put on your main layer of paint. The main camo colour for the tank will be Dunkelgrau. This was made up of AK real colour, Dunkelgrau, flat black and pale grey. For the first layer, I mixed Dunkelgrau and black. This black and Dunkelgrau mix will be the shadow colour. It will be the darkest colour I mix and it will cover the whole model. The colours were mixed at around 3 parts Dunkelgrau and 1 part black. These were then thoroughly mixed together before thinning with Mr. Levelling thinners. The shadow mix was sprayed over the entirety of the model. I used around 20 psi for this. When spraying a shadow colour like this, make sure to get it in all the nooks and crannies. The last thing you want on your finished model is for some light grey to be peeping out. The AK real colours sprayed really nicely. The only downside is the small pot size. Once the first layer had dried, I sprayed the model with a coat of AK Worn Effects. My goal with this model was to hairspray chip every layer, making some very subtle worn paint effects. I used this chipping method between every major paint layer. The next layer of paint to go down was AK Dunkelgrau. This was thinned 1:1 with Mr. Colour Levelling thinners. When applying this, I made sure to leave out any areas that I wanted to remain in deep shadow. With this layer, I also started to sketch out my plan for further modulation. The modulation was built up with mottling. I wanted it to look quite organic. Once the Dunkelgrau layer had dried, I used some warm water and an old brush to chip away some of the paintwork. Once I was happy with the wear and tear on that layer, I sealed it in with VMS Satin Varnish HD. This was thinned 1:1 with their Airbrush Thinners 2.0. It was time to start adding highlights to my Dunkelgrau mix. For the first layer, I added a few drops of AK Pale Grey. This was thinned in a ratio of 1:1 with Mister Leveling Thinners. For each subsequent layer, I added a few more drops of AK Pale Grey to the mix. Over a layer of chipping fluid, I started to spray my first highlight colour. This was built up in light, controlled coats. This layer was chipped, again with my trusty Tatiel brush and some warm water. With a few more drops of AK Pale Grey added to the previous mix, I started to build up the next layer of highlights. This layer was thinned slightly more. This was about 3 parts thinner to 1 part paint. The air pressure was also dropped from 20 to 15 psi. You can see the subtle modulation starting to take shape. I didn't want it to look too smooth. I wanted the surface to look worn and broken up. It's subtle techniques like this that can make a bland monotone finish like a Panzer Grau into something much more interesting to look at. chipping fluid for this layer was activated with less water. I wanted the chips to be more controlled. This is the last layer of grey, I promise. With even more AK pale grey added to my Dunkelgrau mix, I started to pick out some more highlights. This was done carefully so as not to obliterate any of the previous layers' work, and to keep the highlights subtle. After probably boring you to death with hundreds of layers of Dunkelgrau, let's move on to something different. I was tempted to put in a joke about wheels here, but let's keep the commentary rolling. The tyres were painted with a mix of Mission Models black and worn black grey tyres. This was painted with a 2.0 sable brush. The worn metal sections on the sprocket wheels were painted with Citadel Ironbreaker. For the idler wheel I chose a different technique. I got some Mr. Metal Colour aluminium and burnished this on with a cotton bud. For the base colour on the metal of the tools, I used a mix of Vallejo black and German Sea black brown. I'll add some wear and tear to these in the weathering video. On the wire cutters, I painted the Bakelite handles with Vallejo Hull Red. The crushed paper handles were then painted with a mix of US Field Drab and white. On top of this, I stippled on some highly thinned Vallejo Cavalry Brown. All of the handles for the wooden tools were painted in Vallejo ivory. Vallejo ivory makes a really good base colour for wood grain, as it's quite pale and quite neutral, allowing you to bring out any colour you want with your choice of oils later. For the wood grain on this model, I chose only two colours to keep it simple, burnt sienna and burnt umber. This was mixed with VMS Oil Expert Enhancing Medium to help speed up the drying time. After leaving the paint to settle for about 5 minutes, I started working the wood grain in with a tatty old brush. I brushed the oil paint off very gently in the direction I wanted the grain to go. To add some variation to the wood grain, you can wiggle the brush a bit or change the direction of the strokes. This always takes me several passes until I get a result I'm happy with, and any excess oil paint you get on parts you don't want you can clean off with odourless thinners. Just make sure not to wipe away any of your previous work. To add some more definition to the modulation, I picked out some small parts with a mix of Vallejo black, white and field blue. This was mixed in a variety of shades to keep up the visual interest. These mixes were painted on raised details and rivets to simulate the light catching them. I sealed in all my previous work with some VMS satin varnish mixed with their airbrush thinners 2.0. This was mixed at roughly 1:1 and then sprayed over the entire model in 2 light coats. This was sprayed at around 15 psi. Varnishes, especially satin and gloss ones, work best built up in wet coats. I left the VMS varnish to dry for around 20 minutes. To prepare the surfaces for decals, I used Mr. Mark's Sera Neo. The Border Models decals weren't too bad, and they settled down nicely. Any excess water was wicked away from the decals with a dry cotton bud. When the decals were dry, I painted over a layer of microsol to help settle them even further. It was time to paint the tarpaulins I made with paper shaper in last week's episode. They were first prepared with a coat of AK Real Colour flat black. The first tarpaulin was painted with Mission Models Russian Dark Green 4BO. For the second tarp, I added some khaki brown to the mix to add some tonal variation. These were then temporarily put in place to be superglued on later. All the running gear was then pushed into place. Some parts of the running gear were painted with hull red to show replacement parts that hadn't been painted yet. To finish off the painting of my Panzer IV Vorpanzer, everything was sprayed with a layer of VMS Satin Varnish HD. The tie-down rope on the stowage was made with Plus Models 0.3mm lead wire. This was carefully tied off at the ends and then painted to look like rope. And that's it for my painting video of the Border Models 135th Panzer IV F.1 Vorpanzer. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, leave a like and let me know how I did in the comments. I also want to give a big thanks to my patrons for supporting my work. If you're interested, click the card in the corner or check the link in the video description. Don't forget to stay tuned for the next video in the series. Coming up, we've got the tracks and the weathering, so keep your eye out for those. I'm James from LPJ Models. Thanks for watching.